All participants will be in a listen-only mode throughout today's presentation. I'd now like to introduce your host for today's conference, Chris Cox. Thank you. You may begin.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Chris Cox, and I'm one of the cybersecurity instructors here at CDSE. You know, as the saying goes, those that don't understand the past are doomed to repeat it. By knowing what's happened recently, we can start to identify certain trends and certain patterns, and then start to develop strategies on how to combat it in the future. So we're going to look at the top 10 cybersecurity incidents of the past year, and we're going to see what they tell us about the future of security and what we need to be focusing on today. Before we begin, I'd like to orient you to this presentation if you're new to our Adobe Connect sessions. Number one, if you wanted to enlarge the screen in the upper right-hand corner, there's that icon that you can see here, and that'll bring it to full screen so you can see it a little larger. There's been the handouts that have been loaded in the file share section, which is in the lower left-hand section. Simply click on that to download the presentation. And also you can see our closed captioning below. I'd like to give a special shout out to our closed captioners who can always keep up with me somehow. Down to the right are notes and announcements where other things may be added or loaded there so you can see whatever's relevant to this presentation. And then directly to the right is the question and answer pod, or the chat, where you can ask any questions as we go along. Do feel free to chime in at any point, and also towards the end as we open it up for questions. At the very end, there's going to be an opportunity for a poll, some feedback, where you can rate your experience today and share any thoughts about the future. So please do feel free to stay on for that as well. So to begin, I'd like to take you back in time, all the way back to the year 2017. Some say it was a simpler time back then. It was back when Ed Sheehan was topping the charts with The Shape of You. Back in those days, milk cost an average of $3.16 a gallon, and gas was about $2.49. Accounting for inflation, the U.S. dollar is worth about $1 today, and 15,000 of them would get you 1 Bitcoin. That number's changed a little bit since then, and probably since we started this webinar as well. But 2017 was also significant from a cybersecurity perspective. Things continue to change just like they will this year and like they'll continue to in the future. In 2017, more than half of the world's population was online, with more joining every single day. Last year, there were 4,000 ransomware attacks every day, which totaled more than $1 billion in direct ransomware payments worldwide, not to mention the other impacts of lost data. We've also seen a rise in Internet of Things, or IoT devices, such as smart thermostats and appliances, or even toothbrushes. Adding all of those devices to your network has served to increase the overall attack surface. So a new device is attacked about every 2 minutes once you put it on the network, which opens up a point into your network as a whole. There were 1.4 million new phishing websites created every single month last year, which only proves that it's a model that still works. And on average, it took 197 days to detect a breach, which is actually an improvement over previous years. And finally, in 2017, 1 in every 131 emails contained malware. That's nearly 1% of all email traffic was infected with malware. So now let's take a quick look at the top cybersecurity incidents of 2017. These aren't necessarily the largest incidents or the most costly ones, but they're 10 really good examples of how a cybersecurity incident can impact a large number of users or change things within the security community. So coming in with number 10, we're going to start with the Equifax breach. We probably all remember when that happened. Now, Equifax is a credit reporting agency that collects information on over 800 million individuals and multiple other companies. In the breach, 145.5 million individuals were impacted. That's nearly half of the U.S. population at the time, which means there's a pretty good chance that some of you were impacted as well. I was. Now, of course, after other notable breaches in the previous years, we're getting pretty used to it, but this breach was ultimately caused by outdated and unpatched software, specifically Adobe Struts, which is used for creating Java applications. At the time, there was a patch available that was not implemented, but it would have stopped the attack as it was. So as a result, the attackers were able to access dozens of databases and establish more than 30 backdoor connections to maintain their access until it was closed. So in this case, the vulnerability was only discovered 2 months after Adobe put out an alert about it. Excuse me, after Apache put out an alert about it. And the breach itself was discovered 2 months after that point. So it shows how important it is to keep up to date on system patches and to have a vulnerability management plan and to follow it. Scan your systems for known vulnerabilities and configuration errors, and you want to act before the adversary does. Now coming in at number 9, we have Uber. This one's kind of cheating just a little bit because the breach actually happened in 2016, but it wasn't publicly disclosed until 2017. That's an issue in and of itself. We'll talk about that in a moment. So initially, the attackers gained access to the private GitHub account used by the developers. For those unfamiliar, GitHub is a hosting service that's often used by software coders and developers to store code and manage version control. Once they got into the repository, they were able to find additional code that contains some of the login credentials for the systems that were ultimately later compromised. When the attackers contacted Uber to demand a ransom payment for the data before publicly releasing it, the company did pay it, but they recorded it as a legitimate payment under their bug bounty program. A bug bounty program is a program where security researchers are encouraged to find and to responsibly disclose vulnerabilities to the company rather than publicly, and they can be rewarded for that. Because the reward was recorded as a legitimate payment under that bug bounty program, it wasn't publicly disclosed as a ransom payment. 2017 Verizon data breach, which resulted in 14 million customer records being compromised. This included phone numbers and account pins as well. So ultimately, this incident was traced to a subcontractor that maintained a cloud storage server that held sensitive customer information. And what's becoming all too common, the server wasn't properly secured. And in this case, it was because the subcontractor used a password that was easy to guess, and that's exactly what happened. When you take on a partner, you need to ensure that they're going to protect your data at least as well as you would. Anytime you entrust important data to a third party, you're also entrusting their security practices to be effective. And furthermore, this incident really shows how important it is to protect cloud storage accounts in general. By design, they're often web accessible. They can be accessed from anywhere in the world, which means you have to assume that they're going to be actively targeted. They will be. As always, make sure to use strong passwords on all of your accounts and use whatever other security features are available to protect it. So this one was a big deal, and we're still seeing the same effects of the so-called shadow brokers leaks from last year. So first, let me highlight that term leak. Let's discuss what a leak is and what it isn't. A leak is an unlawful release of information that an individual is not authorized to release. This is contrary to, or this can be contrasted against whistleblowing, which is a legally protected act designed to allow an employee to report illegal or immoral acts, most often to law enforcement or some sort of authorized channel. The specific laws related to both are outside of the scope of this webinar, but suffice to say that the shadow brokers, the way that they acquired and publicly released the hacking tools maintained by an NSA partner, it was illegal to do that. They offered the tools for sale to the highest bidder, but they ultimately released many of the same tools and undisclosed vulnerabilities to the public, which did result in hundreds of thousands of compromised systems initially, and more as the information was propagated. The Eternal Blue and WannaCry-based attacks were a direct result of this particular incident. It's worth noting that both the vulnerabilities had patches available at the time, but many organizations hadn't yet installed them. Once again, this really underscores the importance of having an effective vulnerability management program. 2017 also further solidified ransomware as a viable, albeit criminal, method of raising funds. The attackers are using ransomware more and more because it keeps working. People still get infected and they still lose data. In fact, the average ransomware payment has risen to a little over $1,000 to get your data back, with the total impact being $5 billion in 2017. That's including direct ransom payments, lost productivity, and lost business due to not having access to the data. We saw new variants in 2017, such as the WannaCry, Petya, NotPetya, and Netya, and GoldenEye, which that last one made me feel a little nostalgic. People are even selling tools where you can make your own, much like the rootkits back from several years ago, and that we're still seeing today for that matter. There's even the rise of what's being called ransomware as a service, which is a play on words for software as a service, or the other methods, the other models, where you can pay someone in order to craft and to spread ransomware for you. Unfortunately, about 20% of people never get their files back after paying the ransom. Of course, you can avoid that risk by making sure that you properly back up and archive your files. And if it's on the cloud, protect that too. If you properly maintain and store your backups, you're not dependent on the attacker who may or may not release the files once it's done, or once you pay the ransom. Ransomware still works because users keep clicking on those unsolicited attachments and keep opening untrusted files, which often exploits misconfigured or unpatched systems. And the increase in ransomware variants can be tied to the leak that we talked about in the last slide. So make sure that your users and you practice this proper cyber hygiene and to back up your critical data. Now you can decide for yourself if this one counts as an incident, since there's no real indication that the information was ever improperly accessed or used. But it certainly raises some concerns. A security researcher discovered an unsecured database with 1.1 terabytes of voter registration data, 198 million individual voter records. It included names, addresses, and other personal information that was never really intended for public disclosure. Now, it's true that many of the states will release that information when requested, but they often place in limitations on who can request it, who can access it, and how it has to be stored. An open database with no password doesn't exactly comply with that. The aggregated information could have easily been used to support identity theft, which is why it would have been prudent to properly secure it. Interestingly, the database also recorded certain social media postings of some of the users, which was probably used to train software to recognize trends. At number 4, we have the successful hack of the Emmanuel Macron campaign in France. The hack was initially the result of phishing, where key members of the campaign were targeted to obtain their passwords. As a result, 9 gigabytes of emails was leaked to the public. One thing that's interesting about this particular incident is the timing. The leak occurred 2 days before the election, which is the deadline after which French candidates can no longer speak publicly. So there was a limited ability to respond to the information that was put out. Ultimately, the attempt was unsuccessful, and Macron was elected as the president of France. Fortunately, phishing is relatively easy to guard against. People know the right processes and generally what phishing is, but they still keep on clicking those links. Make sure your workforce is trained and aware of the threats and the methods that may be used to target them. And again, use two-factor authentication whenever you can. That way your account can be secured even if your password is compromised. As a side note, don't use SMS-based two-factor authentication if another option is available. Although the risk is relatively low, it's possible to spoof someone's phone number to intercept the verification message as well. Use app or token-based authentication whenever you can, but if it comes down to using SMS-based authentication or none at all, use that. 2017 also saw a continued rise in hacktivism, such as with a group calling itself Dissension, who formed itself specifically for the sole purpose of countering ISIL's online recruitment and planning efforts. Like many online terror groups, ISIL has embraced social media for recruitment and messaging. It's an inexpensive, low-risk way for them to reach and radicalize individuals from all over the world. This group was targeting ISIL on multiple fronts, and last year released over 2,000 email addresses used for some of its mailing lists, and also compromised accounts and the sites that ISIL thought was relatively secure. In one particular case, ISIL messaged that they've brought their systems back up, and they dared the group to hack them. They said it wasn't possible. The next day, that's exactly what happened. They got back in. Ultimately, this was a major blow to the terrorist group's morale, and it also impacted their ability to plan. It's interesting to note that one of the tactics used by Dissension was to stay on the chat, spoofing a legitimate user, or an authorized user rather, and in the online discussion and to feed false information or doubt, which really underscores just how effective this tactic can be. Now at number 2, we have CrashOverride and Triton, a tie between the two. These were two attacks that were used to target specific industrial control systems developed by certain manufacturers, which could theoretically be used to impact the critical infrastructure itself. This one's a tie because they both work in pretty much the same way, and they're intended to do pretty much the same thing, which is to give the attacker access to the control systems. We really don't know how effective these attacks were or could be, or if they're still being used in the wild, but we do know that one was the result of the cause of power outages in Ukraine and unsuccessful attacks in the Middle East. In both cases, the payload required an initial compromise, perhaps by malware or other hacking methods, in order to release the payload onto the network. But the attackers might not have known that changing these files would trigger a shutdown of the systems rather than allow them to actually control the systems themselves. That's not necessarily true in all cases, but that would have been true in these cases. And that's an important note because I think we're going to continue to see the targeting of industrial control systems as they're increasingly relied on for our critical infrastructure. And finally, here at number 1, the Yahoo breaches. This was a big one, and it's now called the largest breach ever discovered with 3 billion accounts impacted. The breach actually happened way back in 2013, so quite some time ago, but it was discovered, the scope of it was discovered at least 3 years later in 2016, and it wasn't until 2017 when Verizon bought Yahoo that we really saw the full scope and the impact of the breach. Yahoo initially blamed state-sponsored actors, but all we can say for certain is that it was an effective use of a spear phishing campaign to leverage further attacks. In this case, the email was sent to multiple Yahoo employees, one of who did open the spear phishing email, and that gave the attacker access to the user database, and that included hashed passwords. Now, theoretically, that should have been secure at that point because the passwords were indeed hashed, but since many of them still used an older algorithm, they were able to be cracked, which allowed the attackers to gain access for additional accounts using password recovery methods once they controlled the initial accounts. We already know what we're supposed to do to prevent things like this. We confirm email senders, we don't click untrusted attachments, and use strong encryption whenever possible. And yet phishing and spear phishing continues to happen. It's really important that we make sure our users are aware of what they're supposed to be doing so that they stop clicking on those files or on those links. It's important to make sure that our users know all this and that we also follow our own processes. This isn't new, it's something that we need to do better. So when we do look at the past, we can learn a lot of important lessons. And that's why we need to continue to be aware of what's going on around us so we can see the trends and the patterns, hopefully before we're victims ourselves. If nothing else, remember these 4 things. Perform regular data backups. That way, even if you're hit with ransomware, somehow lose access to your system, you can restore your critical information. Make sure to patch and update systems. Many attacks can be prevented that way. Plan out ahead of time. Have a vulnerability management plan so you know when you can actually install your patches and keep them up to date as soon as possible. Of course, you have to test these in a non-production environment first, but if you can cut down the time frame between when a patch is made available and when it's installed on the production systems, you can reduce your risk significantly. If you use a cloud account, make sure it's secured and not open to the public. And finally, make sure that your users are trained and aware of the threats that may impact them. That's a big one. It's a matter of making sure that everyone knows what to look out for because it's your users that are on the front line of your network security strategy. Now, I would like to open it up and have an opportunity for any questions. If there's any breaches or cybersecurity incidents that you feel should have been mentioned here, feel free to bring it up, and maybe we can discuss what lessons we can learn from it. At the same time, as you take time to formulate your questions and think about what you'd like to say, I'd like to share some of the resources that you can use in order to stay up to date and to learn from not only the past, but also see the trends as they develop. One is the Verizon Data Breach Report. Every quarter and every year, Verizon creates a data breach report that highlights some of this information. It talks about certain trends in different sectors and talks about what is they're seeing from their perspective as they put this information together. InfraGard is a great resource. It's a public-private partnership between the FBI and the private sector, which is designed to share information across agencies and with the public at large. FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center. This is not only a place where you can report cyber crimes, but they also aggregate their data every year and every quarter once again, and they put it together for easy digestion. SANS is another great resource. And No More Ransom. No More Ransom is a great resource for combating ransomware, where a conglomeration or grouping of cybersecurity researchers and antivirus manufacturers and other interested parties have come together trying to stop ransomware before it spreads. This is a place where you can often find the decryption keys for ransomware once that's been put out or that ransomware has been cracked or defeated. I also encourage you to keep up to date with our Twitter, with CDSE's Twitter, where we try to release certain trends as they develop, so you can see what's going on as well and what we're trying to combat and raise awareness for on our side. So I do see some questions coming in, so I appreciate that. Start with, do you have any details on how many companies pay the ransom and then do not get the files unlocked? And that's a great question. Really, that's not as granular because that's not put out on a per company or per segment basis. But the overall statistics are about 20% of all who pay the ransom, both individuals and companies, do not get their files back. This isn't always malicious. In some cases, this is the result of poorly coded software or an individual who has modified other ransomware in order to make a profit off of it and didn't follow through with that next step. Ultimately, paying a ransom it funds whoever it is that's putting out the ransomware. This might be organized crime, terrorist groups, or other groups that are trying to make money off of this. It's in their best interest to give you the decryption key after you pay the money. Otherwise, they'll have a reputation for not following through, and people won't pay the ransom. So many cases where the ransom is not, where the files are not released and the system is not decrypted after the fact, it's simply because the software was coded improperly. Whatever the case may be, there's always that risk. And the only way that you can really get rid of that risk is not to rely on the attacker who does not have your best interests at heart, but to control the data yourself. So backups, backups, backups. Another question, will this recording be available? Yes, it will be available. It'll be recorded on captured on the CDSE webinar archive webpage, much like any of the other ones that we've released that are publicly releasable as well. So you can always look at that. You can look at this recording, and you can look at other ones from the recent past also. How do you activate two-factor authentication, and on what types of accounts you can use this? That is a great question and a really important one as well. You can activate two-factor authentication. It depends on the platform, but most current software and web-based providers will offer some form of two-factor authentication. You can find that somewhere in the settings. It should be enabled on your email. So for most web-based emails such as Yahoo, Gmail, Hotmail, and anything else, you can activate two-factor authentication. For example, for my email provider, when I log in with a valid username and password, it prompts me on my phone, not via SMS, but through the app itself, and it tells me I tried to log in at this time from this location. Is that actually me, yes or no? And that way I can not only control my account or secure my account a little bit better, but I know that if there's an attack happening that may impact me. It's a good indication of a broader attack pattern. And this might be off topic, but if an employee does not show up to work in the past 3 days and we can't contact him, he has abandoned his job, what are the steps we need to take? That is an excellent question. Of course, much of that would be left to HR or whatever the processes within the company may be. But at that point, you really have to be concerned not only for the well-being of the employee, but also the well-being of the company and the data as well. It's not uncommon for an employee who has left under maybe difficult or suspicious circumstances to use their legitimate access later. At that point, they become an insider threat. And of course, an insider using their legitimate access can be far more devastating and far more dangerous than any outsider that doesn't have authorized access. So at that point, it's really important, and there should be procedures in place for this across the board, to engage security, to engage IT and other aspects of the business in order to make sure that they can't access the account remotely until their whereabouts have been determined or what happened has been determined. Make sure that if they do try to log in, that's somehow flagged so you know that there may be something going on. or of course to make sure that any VPN access or remote system access or building access or whatever else is captured and is dealt with before it can be the point where you're worrying about them taking data or uploading malware or destroying data or anything else. So very good question. Okay, I'll leave open for just another moment to see if anyone else has any other questions they'd like to come up with. Of course, if you think about any questions later, you're always free to visit the CDSE website. That'll give you the ability to contact us, ask any questions that you have. Feel free to send us a tweet, whatever the case may be, and we'll get back to you. We'd love to talk about things a little bit further as well. So barring any other questions, we're going to go ahead and bring up the poll. We're going to close that out. I do want to thank you for spending time with me today, and I hope you got as much out of it as I did. Please take the time to fill out these questions here. We really do look very carefully at these. We really do want to know what we need to do better and what we can do to better meet your needs. So please do feel free to give us feedback as far as how we did today. So until next time, stay safe, and thank you.
Thank you for joining today's conference. You may disconnect at this time.